Welcome to the Branding Room Only podcast, where we share career stories, strategies, and lessons learned on how industry leaders and influencers have built their personal brands. Now, let's get started with the show. Hi, everyone. It's Paula. Wanted to do a little intro to today's conversation with Alphonso David. This was one that I really wanted to have. Alphonso is a friend, a leader in civil rights and economic justice, and as you'll hear more about, he's the president and CEO of the Global Economic Forum. As we approach this pivotal election, I wanted to have the conversation, not just because of Alphonso's work, it is vital, but because this message is so essential for all of us to hear. This election impacts not only the Black community, but all of us as we consider essentially what's riding on the future of our democracy. And so as a Black woman, lawyer, leader, and mother, bringing this conversation to you felt essential, and it is a part of my brand, and it's also part of my responsibility. So let's get into it. Let's get to the branding room. Hi, everybody. It's Paula Edgar, your host of Branding Room Only, where we talk to leaders about their personal brands and their journeys. I am so excited for my guest today, Alphonso David. He is a civil rights attorney and president and CEO of the Global Black Economic Forum. With over 2 decades of experience across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, he is a fierce advocate for social and economic justice for marginalized communities worldwide. Alphonso, welcome to the Branding Room.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So I'm excited to have this conversation. We have had the opportunity to know each other in lots of different ways, and I really wanted to make sure that my audience got to know you too. I start off the podcast asking the same question to everyone, which is, what does a personal brand mean to you? How do you define it?
For me, a personal brand is what you do, what you accomplish, what distinguishes you from everyone else. Mm-hmm. A personal brand for me is not about a title. It's not about a job. Mm-hmm. It's really about what you do, what you accomplish, and what distinguishes you from anyone else on the globe.
I love that unique value proposition. So tell me, how would you describe yourself in 3 words or short phrases?
Okay. 3? Only 3 words?
Only 3. Either 3 words or 3 short phrases.
Okay, I'm going to give you one sentence. Does that work?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Diplomatic, fearless warrior for liberation.
Oh, I love that. Okay.
Because I'm both diplomatic but fearless. Mm-hmm. And I'm a warrior. Yeah. And my focus is on liberation.
I love that. So do you have a favorite quote or mantra?
I have 2 that I often go back to. Okay. The first one is, your life will shrink or expand proportional to your courage. Mm-hmm. And the second for me is, principles only mean something if we stick by them in inconvenient times.
Oh, yeah, that resonates.
I go back to both of those because often in our lives, we are confronted with challenges, whether in our personal lives or professional lives, and we have to decide in those moments how we show up.
Yeah.
And if we show up through the lens of fear, it dictates one certain type of result. Mm-hmm. You show up through the lens of courage, it dictates a very different type of result.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm going to come back to that courage part. Do you have a hype song? So for me, a hype song is 2 things. It's either the song that's playing when they're going to get full Alphonso David is coming in, it's playing in your head, or if you're having a bad day and you need to get yourself back up there, and it can be the same song or 2 different ones. What do you have?
I'm being difficult here because I'm not giving you one song. Can I give you a few?
Yes, you can.
I'm just going back to when I have to prepare for an oral argument in court, or I have to give a presentation that is going to, so much is weighing on the presentation, or if I'm facing some type of existential crisis or moment, there are a few things I'll listen to.
Okay.
One is God Will Take Care of You by Aretha Franklin.
back.
It's just from that gospel album that she did that just grounds me.
Mm-hmm.
Another is Everything by Lauryn Hill.
Yep. Yep.
And the last one would be In the Mix by Mix Masters, which is a dance song that I love.
Okay. So at the end of each year, I put together a playlist of all of the songs that my guests have. And the playlist right now is wild. So it's like trap music, hip hop, gospel. But I love that because, what inspires or gets us going is, for me, it's always Prince. It just depends on what in the discography. But my song, whenever I'm going to get on the stage, is Baby, I'm a Star, over and over and over again. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you grew up, or you were born in Maryland.
Yes.
But you were raised in Liberia.
Yeah.
In a rough political time. Tell me what you think about those early experiences and how it might have shaped your brand and your commitment to social justice.
Well, I think my personal childhood experiences really informed and continue to inform my worldview. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a democracy in Liberia. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, like many other parts, I should say, not many, but other mm-hmm. parts of the world, that democracy was challenged. And we unfortunately suffer the consequences of that. Mm-hmm. I come from a political family, if you will. My father was the mayor of Monrovia, which is the capital city of Liberia, and my uncle was the president of Liberia. Mm-hmm. And in the early 1980s, there was Liberia went through a tumultuous time, mm-hmm. and there was a military coup. And my uncle was assassinated. My father was arrested and put in prison. We were placed under house arrest. And for me, going through that experience as a young child changed how I see the world, mm-hmm. and how I think about priorities. And, I was being reared to become a surgeon, mm-hmm. a medical doctor. And after the war, I completely shifted my interest, mm-hmm. and it shifted from medicine to the law. Mm-hmm. And that was in large part because of the war and seeing how you could lose your freedom overnight. Mm. Seeing how you could be persecuted because of your political beliefs, mm-hmm. or your alliances or lack thereof with certain groups of people, how you could be persecuted because of your tribal affiliation. Mm-hmm. And it's really shaped my thinking on how we achieve equity and equality and economic justice for marginalized communities, because we see this concept of factionalization, if you will, mm-hmm. manifest itself all over the globe. And there are so many direct and indirect collateral consequences of that. And one of them is our failure as people of color to really achieve true economic justice and freedom. Mm-hmm. Because we're often the ones that are being attacked. We're often the ones that are, either we're living in countries where we're the racial minorities, or we're in countries where a certain segment of our populations are being demoralized and stripped of the protections and rights that they deserve. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's really what shaped my commitment to social and economic justice over the past several decades.
I mean, wow. So, I often ask my guests about their upbringing, because I do think that how you grow up does shape you, the where, the how, the what. But that experience, and I, as you were talking, I was thinking about my own experience and my mother was one of the victims in 9/11. She was killed in the towers. Mm. And the switch from sort of being like, all right, I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do with the world, and then being truly saying, I have to do and be something more. I decided to go into the law after my mother was killed. Like, it really catalyzed for me that number one, life is short and we just don't, right? And number two, that there is much more for us as Black people. One of the things that I have been committed to is making sure that people remember that there were people of color and Black people who were killed in 9/11, and because much of the news did not portray that. And as you were talking, I thought to myself, there's so many folks who are catalyzed because of tragedy and because of the challenges they experience. But when you just mentioned democracy, I thought to myself, what a 360 you must be feeling in in how you have been, your upbringing, and then where we are with the democracy that we are living in now and your role in it. Tell us a little bit about your career path, right? Leading you up to being the president of the Black Economic Forum. What have you experienced and what brought you to where we are now?
So the through line, and I'll walk you through my path, but the through line has really been the quest for fairness and justice. And I, of course, went to college, graduated from college, ran a company, a government contracting firm for a number of years. I went to law school, graduated from law school, received a federal clerkship, which is a huge privilege and an honor. Very, very few law students are able to secure a federal clerkship. And I clerked for the Honorable Clifford Scott Green, who was one of the first Black justices that was appointed in the Third Circuit. I clerked for him. And then I worked for a major law firm in Philadelphia called Blank Rome, where I did litigation and corporate transactions and intellectual property litigation. It was a fantastic experience because I got to hone my skills. I got to be in the courtroom and represent clients and, do some of the not so glamorous discovery responses and requests that we sometimes have to do. So I did that for a number of years. And I left the firm and accepted a position as a counsel for an addiction treatment center in California. Fred Siegel at the time had reached out through some associates, and they wanted to recruit me to run a company for them, an addiction treatment center that was really focused on providing some philanthropic support to communities that were impacted by addiction in Los Angeles. So I moved from the East Coast to the West Coast to run that company. And then a few years later, there was a Supreme Court decision, Lawrence versus Texas, that shifted my focus back to the East Coast. That decision essentially decriminalized intimate conduct between two consenting adults who happened to be of the same sex. And I took a role at a civil rights organization called Lambda Legal. And I litigated cases with Lambda for about 3 years. Employment discrimination cases, health-related cases. I litigated the marriage case here in New York. I then left the not-for-profit space and then went into government. And I worked at the Division of Human Rights, which is the oldest human rights agency in the country, I believe 1945. So I worked with them in sort of revamping and revising their operations. And then I worked at the Attorney General's office as the bureau chief for civil rights, and had a number of lawyers working with me, litigating cases all over the state of New York, from housing to employment to public accommodations, and seeing really the tapestry that is discrimination in a state, right? You get to see it all. We brought pattern and practice cases against employers, against housing providers. So I did that for a number of years. I was then recruited to work in the governor's office, and I was the governor's chief policy advisor on civil rights and labor. And I held that role for about 4 years. And I mean, there are so many things that I was able to work on during those 4 years that I'm extremely proud of, from helping to draft the marriage equality law in New York that ultimately resulted in the Supreme Court overturning the Defense of Marriage Act, to working on criminal justice reform and working on the minimum wage legislation and paid family leave. I then, after 4 years of doing that work, ended up becoming the chief counsel to the governor of New York. I became the first Black man to serve in that role. And I did that for another 4 years. So I ended up spending 12 years in government, and then left and ran the Human Rights Campaign for about 2 years. Also became the first Black person to run that organization.
Mhm.
And then left, and now I run the Global Black Economic Forum.
Mhm.
And if you look at that trajectory from running a government contracting firm before law school to now running the Global Black Economic Forum, for me the through line is, how do we advance equity? How do we advance social justice? How do we advance economic opportunity for marginalized communities?
Mhm.
Because the law has been utilized for decades to oppress marginalized groups. It's been manipulated to make us less than a full person under the Constitution. Has been manipulated to justify separate but equal, right? So how do we work with the law? How do we utilize the law to advance policies and regulations and statutes and litigation that supports marginalized communities? And that's really how I think about my career, that all of those jobs are really focused on the same thing. They just happen to have different titles.
Yeah. You say that, but I think when you just laid that out, I met you several times in that trajectory, but the two things that I remember were when you were counsel to the governor, and we honored you for the Black Bar when I was president. And point of privilege, because it's my podcast, I'll never forget that I had been in the hospital right before the gala where you were honored, and you were sitting next to me as an honoree, and I kept wanting to get up, and you kept being like, sit down, sit down, sit down. And my husband so appreciated, because he's on the other side of me being like, sit down, sit down. So appreciate, he still mentions it, that you were here as an honoree, but you were caring for, you cared for me. And I appreciate that. And I love to tell people when they have made an impact on me. And that really, it reminded me that I don't have to do everything, which is important. But number two, that, you're there, and you're about to be honored glory. and you were thinking about me. And I appreciated that. The second one was during the pandemic. We did a podcast, well, a video like we're doing now for the Black Bar. And it was with Jason, who is one of my mentees from law school, and he was working with you at the time. And I just remember how much fun we had during the conversation. And so anyway, I'll get back on my path now. I just wanted to reflect on that because I can. So
this is your show.
It is. The branding room only is my room. So one of the things you didn't mention just now in your long list of impact and roles that you've had is that you are counsel to the Fearless Fund. And in that role, you have had to navigate some of the challenges, and I'll say that lightly, of the backlash and attacks that have levied towards anything that's trying to provide equity to communities that have been marginalized, and in this case, to the Fearless Fund, which provides grants to Black women entrepreneurs. Can you talk a little bit about the case, the challenges, and what you would advise other people who are facing this current backlash, which is right now robust? I'll say that.
Sure. So for folks who may not know, the Fearless Fund is a venture capital firm as well as a charitable organization. It was started about 5 or 6 years ago. A Black woman who was seeking funding for her business ventures kept on facing challenges and obstacle after obstacle after obstacle to obtain funding. For folks who may not know, the construct for venture capitalism is, if I own a business and I would like to grow that business, I go out and I seek investors. And those investors will invest in my company in exchange for, in some cases, equity. So they may get a percent or 5% of my company in exchange for their investment. And that is the tool that many people use to grow and really scale their business ventures. And she was looking for some help to scale her firm and her business ideas, and kept on facing obstacle after obstacle. So she created the Fearless Fund, working with others, but really created the Fearless Fund and the charitable organization associated with it to address this problem. And it's a pretty significant problem. $288 billion every year is allocated through the venture capital space. And of the 288 billion with a B that's allocated every year, less than 1% goes to all Black people. And 0.036% goes to Black women.
Wow.
So that's a huge disparity. And her goal was to create a company and a charitable organization to try to address that problem, and had been very successful for about 5 years. And then on a fateful day in August of last year, 2023, they were served with a federal complaint that suggested that one of their programs, because they had multiple programs, and they still do, but one of their programs provided grants to Black women. And the argument that was posited in the complaint was that by providing grants to Black women, the Fearless Fund was violating federal law. So you ask, well, what is that federal law that they were apparently violating? Well, the argument was that Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1866, to allow Black people to enter into contracts.
Post-Civil War.
Post-Civil War. Just for folks who,
right,
just so we can remember, during the Civil War, we were considered property. We couldn't enter into contracts. We couldn't own property, couldn't get an education, right? So post-Civil War, this statute is passed that says, hey, we are going to allow Black people to enter into contracts in the same way white people can enter into contracts. And what happened with the Fearless Fund is they're using that statute to argue that by providing grants to Black women to address this ongoing systemic inequity, it violates 1981 of the Civil Rights Act. So we took on the case, created a legal team, if you will, that included Gibson Dunn and serving as our lead counsel, and others came to the table from Danielle Connolly to Ben Crump. And we worked collectively to defend the Fearless Fund in federal court. And we were successful. In the district court, we argued successfully that the grant was being issued by a charitable organization. And charitable organizations have a First Amendment right to issue grants consistent with their missions. That is not a secret, and that has been happening for decades. From the Ford Foundation to Open Society, from smaller not-for-profit organizations to mid-sized organizations. And the Fearless Fund should be treated no different than every other charitable organization out there. And the court agreed that charitable organizations have a First Amendment right to issue grants consistent with their mission. The court also concluded that the plaintiffs were unlikely to succeed on the merits of the case. Well, they filed an emergency appeal that ultimately ended up before a 3-judge panel before the 11th Circuit. And 2 of the 3 judges concluded that the district court was wrong. First, the court concluded that the plaintiffs had standing to file the lawsuit. Now, for the non-lawyers, why is that important? It's important because in our case, the plaintiffs were anonymous. We still don't know who they are. We don't know if they're real. We don't know if they have legitimate businesses. But the court in the 11th Circuit concluded that they had standing to sue, and that should strike a chord in everyone, whether you run a business or a charitable organization, because what that means is in the 11th Circuit, someone could file a lawsuit to close down your business or your program, and you may not even know who they are. And they may get the right, or they may have the ability to actually shut down that program or your business. And I mean, that is not the law, because the Second Circuit has disagreed with that. So the Second Circuit, of course, is in New York and other parts of the Northeast. But the 11th Circuit has disagreed and concluded in our case that they had the right to file the lawsuit, and also concluded that they were likely to succeed on the merits. And so we ultimately had a decision to make whether we would litigate the case in that circuit or we would settle the case in such a way that it would have limited impact. And so that's what we did. We settled the case so that it is limited only to that one program that was ending anyway. And it does not apply in any way to the Fearless Fund's grants, current or future grants, current or future programs, current or future investments, current or future mentoring programs.
Mhm.
It doesn't apply to how they operate. And so for us, that is a huge win for the Fearless Fund, but also a huge win for anyone who cares about equity.
Mhm.
Because the goal of our opponents is to essentially strip race from every single statute, regulation, and policy in this country.
Mm.
Because they believe that we live in a race-neutral country, which is obviously obscene. We don't. They don't deny that there is a huge disparity in funding. Why? Because the data is the data. $288 million, less than 1% to Black people. There is a disparity.
Billion with the B.
With a B. There's a disparity. So they can't deny the disparity, and yet they are looking to strip those who are disadvantaged from the ability to engage in self-help, which to me is an anathema to this concept of free enterprise. Right? Those who have considered themselves ultra-conservative say we have to embrace free enterprise in a capitalist country. Well, if that's the case, you are then restricting free enterprise for those who are oppressed. And that's essentially what the Fearless Funds represents. And that's why we fought so hard against that principle, and why we believe the result in this case not only protects the Fearless Fund moving forward, but it also protects anyone who is looking to continue to advance marginalized communities in this country.
It's really why I wanted to have you explain what has happened and where we are right now, because I do think there's a lot of misinformation around exactly what everything means. But this is a perfect lead into the next question, because there's so much misinformation, disinformation, wrong information that is happening everywhere, but in particular in our country. One of the reasons why I really wanted to have a conversation with you was to think about how to counter that. And in particularly, because I would say a majority of my listeners are Black or Black adjacent, meaning that they have Black people in their lives, which should be everybody. But I want to hear what your thoughts are as our election is looming next week. What should be at the forefront for Black people for this election?
Freedom. It's as simple as freedom. For me, this election is about our ability to be free. And it's not a hyperbolic response, very real. We don't have economic freedom currently. We don't have the ability to reach the level of success collectively as a class and as a group that we should in this country. And that is because there have been barrier after barrier after barrier that has been created for decades. It has been intentional. And so it is not a coincidence that the majority of folks in the C-suite are not people of color and are not women. It is not a coincidence that the majority of people that are serving on major boards around the country are not women and are not people of color. So either you're going to argue that women and people of color are not as smart, not as ambitious, not as driven, not as accomplished, or you're going to recognize that this disparity exists and we have to do something about it. This election is about our ability to break down those walls that have been enshrined in our statutes and our regulations and in our institutions. And if we don't continue the path forward, we will actually lose the ability to engage. I know this is not a political podcast, but I'll just say one of the candidates has said that if people vote for him, they don't have to vote again. Because I went through experience living in a country that shifted from a democracy to a dictatorship, I understand what those words mean, and I believe him. And if you believe that, well, it could never happen in the United States of America, think again. The United States Supreme Court just issued a ruling that concluded that Donald Trump is immune from criminal prosecution for acts that takes place when he is president. Think about what that means. think about what that means as it relates to marginalized communities in this country. If the president of the United States is immune for acts that takes place when that person is president, essentially they can target any community to be free of criminal prosecution because they're doing it under the guise of the presidency. So this election is hugely important for us as marginalized communities, for us as Black people, for women who have now been stripped of their right to bodily integrity. This is probably, I mean, I know we hear it every 4 years, but this is the most consequential election, certainly in my lifetime, where we have an opportunity to either turn the page or we go backwards.
Yeah, it's sobering to think that that we're actually even in conversation about this, that it's even a possibility. I recently went to an event at the Museum of the City of New York, where they currently have a exhibit about Shirley Chisholm, and the conversation was about, from Chisholm to Harris, the state of Black women in politics, and Dr. Jelani Cobb, and there were two other historians and educators who were on the panel. We're talking about this, and the challenge that I find, because again, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this podcast is because I wanted to make sure that folks got to understand how important I think branding is and to give people visibility, et cetera. But it's also for me to talk about who I am and why things are important to me. And me being Black is a very big part of who I am. And so is being a woman. And so is being a leader. And there's this feeling of disbelief that we're even looking at this as an equal or close to equal challenge. And when folks are now talking about DEI and saying that DEI is, bad, insert whatever word you want to use here. And then I think about this on this literal scale where we're looking at someone who is unqualified versus somebody who is uber qualified being looked at similarly. And much of the reason has to do with money and race. It makes you think, I used to often laugh and say, I'm not, political, I'm political, right? But this is really and truly wild. And I say that because I don't know what else to say, but I'm glad I wanted to make sure we touched upon that, because I do want to make sure that folks hear and understand that while this is not a political podcast, it is my podcast, and my identity and the identities that I have are important to who I am and how I show up. And that's it. That's all. That's in a nutshell. I want to pull back a little bit because I want to know in specific, how does the work that you do with the Global Black Economic Forum intercept with the priorities we just talked about? Like what in terms of thinking about our freedom and our liberation and equity, how does the work that you do specifically help the Black community in those ways?
Well, we're at the Global Black Economic Forum. We're focused on advancing economic opportunity and economic justice for members of the Black diaspora and other marginalized communities. And we're doing that because economic justice is the cornerstone of freedom. So you can pass legislation that prohibits discrimination. But if the doors are still closed, if you're really being denied opportunities, because remember, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed decades ago, and yet we still suffer wide-ranging disparities in industry after industry. So yes, we're technically free. The 13th Amendment was passed. It prohibits slavery, but we're still running with the shackles of slavery because we're not able to run freely. And so we have to break off those shackles so we can actually run freely and run at the speed that no one can imagine. But we don't achieve economic freedom we don't achieve freedom generally, I should say, without the ability to engage in free enterprise. Again, going back to the Fearless Fund. That's why all of this work is so important. And let's not forget that, yes, we are making progress. I don't want to suggest that we are where we were in 1964. We are making progress, But let's also recognize that we're also going backwards. When Martin Luther King gave his speech on the March on Washington, the wealth gap, not the wage gap, but the wealth gap, meaning how many assets do you have that you can pass on to your children or to your descendants? The wealth gap was 8-1 between white people and Black people. Today, the wealth gap is 12-1. So maybe we're talking about increases in wages, which is incredibly important. But we also have to talk about the ability to ascertain generational wealth, which makes a huge difference in actually ascertaining freedom. And that is the cornerstone of what we're doing at the Global Black Economic Forum. All of these priorities that we often talk about, addressing health disparities, or being able to control our bodies, or being able to invest in the way that we would like to invest, are incredibly important and are all interconnected. Social, economic justice are interconnected, and they actually lead to freedom.
So that's a lot, right? One of the things that I want to think about often when I'm talking to leaders is, how do you manage all of that a lot? As a leader, I used to ask the question, what keeps you up at night? And then I kept getting some answers where I was like, well, that's a lie. It's keeping me up at night now. So how are you navigating all of that as a leader? Like, I don't even know what the actual question is. I'm just thinking that's a lot of weight. And how do you shoulder that?
I remember every time I feel that I'm getting to the edge of feeling overwhelmed, I think about our ancestors. It never fails. Reason I do that is because doing the comparative analysis is very sobering.
Yes.
Understanding that people die for my ability to even have the conversation. Just to have the conversation. Right? There was a point in time that I would be killed just for engaging in a debate. Right? So when I put it in perspective, the weight that's on my shoulders, I see not only as a privilege, but a responsibility. Because this is their legacy. We are standing on their shoulders. And we have to think about this work through the lens of the community as opposed to through the lens of the self. And our political system now has moved closer and closer and closer towards the self. It's rare that people talk about who they're voting for through the lens of the community. They're often talking about what this means for them. And as I think about my work and what keeps the fuel in the car is the community. If this is about self-glory, it's not fulfilling. It's not rewarding. And in some cases, it's counterintuitive. But this work has to be about the community. And it also has to be about these sacrifices that our ancestors made for us to be able to fight for change.
Thank you for that. It was a much needed reminder, because it is. It just is. And I was looking at something the other day online, and a woman was speaking about her childhood and the first time she was able to vote, that essentially there was a poll tax, and the poll tax.
I saw that.
Right. Was either that they had to, they would pay that money or they wouldn't eat. Right. Like, so they had to choose between, voting and exercising their rights or eating. And when I hear people talk about not voting or voting differently than the community might need, I'll say that. It is frustrating because it then reminds me, to your point about how things can go astray. Like I love history. I studied anthropology. I studied what cultures do. And this is pivotal for us to be reflective on, that we have to take care of each other. And I would have hoped, I thought that when we had COVID, that would be like, oh my gosh, Now we realize just how interdependent we are on each other. And in fact, I think it made us much more divided, because you could see even during COVID, people were like, I'm not going to wear this mask because I don't like how it feels. As opposed to that, I want to take care of the people who need me to wear the mask. And so I'll leave that piece with just saying that if there's anybody who's listening, and I hope not, who is even anticipating not voting as an option, I encourage you to think about our community, and I mean our joint collective community, and what we need from each other to thrive. And whatever you decide your community is, we all as a collective community are going to be impacted by whatever we decide to do individually, and we're voting. And so, please vote.
And remember, for folks who are thinking about this is just not about the presidency.
Oh, right.
There are many, many, many roles that are up for election this year, from the Senate to the House, in some cases. Please make sure that you understand and appreciate that when you vote, you're voting for your local council, you're voting for your district attorney, you're voting for the attorney general in some cases. You're voting for people that directly affect your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
In the life of your community.
Yes. And the judge's piece is important. Like, you're more likely to interact with the judge than you are with the president. Like, just keep it real. Okay. So that was a lot. That was heavy. So now I want to talk about fun stuff.
Okay.
What do you do for fun? Please tell me it's a lot of things, because that was a lot.
Oh, it's a lot of things. So I love music. I love live music.
Yes.
Jazz is one of my favorites. Soul, R&B, pop, classical, all of it. I love live music. Okay. So as often as I can get out to listen to live music, I do. I love film. When we grew up, we didn't have a lot of movies that we were able to see in Liberia. But when we came to the US, I fell in love with film. So I watch a lot of international film as well. That brings me a lot of comfort. I also work out a lot. I work out every day. I do vinyasa yoga in a heated room. I do calisthenics. I do weight training, rock climbing, tennis. So I'm very active. And that is, for me, a channel where I'm able to relieve stress, but it also is a way where I'm able to connect with my body in a way that when you're working all the time, you don't get a chance to do. I also like to read. Lots of James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, two of my favorites. And reading and film sort of do similar things for me. They provide a window into someone else's perspective and life experience and viewpoint. And what has been really extraordinary to me about those two, I don't want to call it genres, but those two spheres, if you will, is you're able to learn something new about how you react and how you process information. So that's why I love to read. That's why I love film. They feed my soul. They challenge me to think about the world in different ways and challenge my perspectives as well.
Yes. And allow you to get away.
Yeah. And then finally, I love to cook. So,
okay.
Yeah, I love to cook. My dad was very, very clear on this when we were growing up, that all of his kids had to learn how to cook, not just the girls.
Yes. So. Yes. Good. Now I know that if I'm hungry, I'm coming over. Okay. So as we wind down, there are two questions that I ask everybody on the podcast. And one is this: what is your stand by your brand? I call it. What is the authentic aspect of your personal brand that you will never compromise on?
Integrity.
Love that. Okay. So branding room only is a play on the term standing room only, because I'm clever. So I ask everyone this: what is your magic? What is something that folks would be in a room, standing room only, to experience about you?
I have this unique ability to create effective teams. I can assess skill sets. understand what is complementary and what isn't, and put together really effective teams.
Wow.
I also have special skills when it comes to strategy and legal and policy analysis and writing and public speaking. Those things I recognize are, I don't want to say easy, but they come more naturally to me. I'm able to really think about. I play multiple chess in my head when I think about legal strategy or policy analysis, and I know that is not common.
That's
So,
true.
So I would say those would be some of the few things.
I love that. And I want to thank you deeply for taking some time out to speak with me and kiki a little bit, as opposed to cry, with my people. And how can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
So I'm on, I think, all of the platforms. They can go to alphonsodavid.com, which is a website that has a lot of background about me, or you can go and find me on LinkedIn or IG or Facebook, and it's at Alphonso David. You can also get more information at the Global Black Economic Forum, which is gbef.com.
Perfect. Thank you for joining me. Everybody, listen, please tell a friend, and share it with that friend. You know the one I'm talking about who needs to hear it, and tell them to share it with their father-in-law who needs to hear it too. That being said, I will see you next time in the branding room, and always stand by your brand. Talk to y'all soon. Bye.
Yeah.
Wow. Wasn't that a powerful conversation today with Alphonso? The conversation touched on his remarkable career, his leadership, and so many of the critical issues that are at stake in this election. And for me, I really want you to remember this conversation wasn't just a timely one, it was a personal one. Our conversation today reflected on my identity as a Black woman, a lawyer, a mother, and that's why it's so important for me to bring these conversations to you as my listeners. So if today's conversation resonated, please share it with a friend, a colleague, a family member, and encourage them to do the same. I want us all to understand what's riding on this election for ourselves, for our communities, and for our future. As always, thank you for joining me in the branding room, and stand by your brand. See you next time.